I'm making a retro-style survival horror game inspired by classics like Resident Evil and Silent Hill, called The Revanchist. It's been in the works for about 5 months now and is moving along fast. I've just got the results from my first round of playtesting, and the results have been very enlightening. We're gonna get to that, but first, I want to take a second to properly introduce the game. So I've been getting a lot of new viewers lately, and people tend to go straight to my first video to learn what the game is, and aside from just being a terrible video, I really don't explain things well, and a lot of my plans have changed. If you're already familiar and want to skip to the playtesting results, here's the timestamp for that. So The Revanchist is a first-person survival horror game built on Unreal Engine 5, with retro-inspired visuals and gameplay. Very heavily inspired by Resident Evil in particular, but also borrowing from games like Silent Hill and Fatal Frame. And even taking inspiration from some literature such as H.P. Lovecraft's The Rats in the Walls. It didn't start this way though. It came into existence in 2014 as a crappy haunted house game that I never finished. I kept kicking around ideas for it and other horror games I'd like to make, and eventually in 2019 this all came together and grew into The Revanchist. Originally the game was going to have a lot more action, an open world, and most notably, realistic graphics. If you want the full history of all this, you can check out this video here, link in the description. Either way, as I worked on that, I noticed a handful of problems. Firstly, the workload. Realistic visuals are a ton of work. In general, I don't like using pre-made assets and try to do everything myself from scratch. Problem is, even though I know how to make some decent looking 3D art, I'm not actually good at it. I'm self-taught in every sense of the phrase. How I learn is I open a piece of software and I start fucking around until I get a result I'm happy with. As such, I really don't have the skills to be efficient at it. Case in point, this shotgun here. Probably took me about 20 hours to make, and that's half of a work week for you unemployed chads out there. So to save time, I cut corners and take shortcuts. What that gives is a mediocre end result that still takes most of a day, and in general, I could expect to make 2 props per day of work. And for contrast, with this new low polygraphic style, I made both of these levels in their entirety in 1 day of work. So hopefully that helps put things in perspective. Basically, with the old version, my options were either leave the environments barren and empty or totally phone it in and get lazy. I could never pull off this level of detail with realistic visuals. Issue number 2. High-res visuals need every other aspect to be at the same level. The graphics serve as the first impression of the game and really set the standard for what to expect. If a game has high fidelity, photorealistic graphics but poor sound design, animation, gameplay, etc., it creates a negative experience where things are worse than you expected. But if a game has simpler, more stylized visuals, you can get away with a lot more. And if anything, sound design, animations, gameplay, etc. are of a higher standard than the visuals, it creates a positive experience where things are simply better than what you were expecting. I'm not a programmer. If you need some JavaScript to tell you whether a number is prime or not, I'm your guy. Anything more than that is uncharted territory for me. I'm also not an animator, sound designer, anything like that. And bear in mind, it took years of practice to get where I am in 3D graphics. Stands to reason it would take about as much time to get to the same level in any of those other areas, and I don't feel like waiting several decades to make this game, so that's out. And finally, it's scarier. When you can't clearly see something, your brain fills in the gaps, usually with something a lot more vivid and impactful than what's actually there. If you wonder why horror is usually set in a dark environment and why horror movies usually avoid showing the monster clearly, this is why. Case in point, this freezer. What does this look like to you? Probably not much. It's just a picture of some giblets tinted yellowish green with some low-res bugs on it. Would you believe half the playtesters thought it was a body? Would you believe I actually had a friend quit the game because they were too freaked out by it and I had to convince her to keep playing? Over this! Because when it looks like this, your brain fills it in with the worst case scenario, whatever's scariest to you in particular, and you end up freaking yourself out. Which, by the way, is why the pixelation is non-negotiable, sorry not sorry. Also, these visuals are great for performance. Load times for levels are between 1 second and 1 frame. It also currently pulls perfect frame rates all the way down to a GTX 1060 with fully ray traced lighting, shadows, and maxed settings. And it even runs, with some concessions, on my 100 Canadian peso laptop with an i3 and integrated graphics. Again, Unreal Engine 5 game with fully ray traced lighting. Like, can you guess the difference in memory usage between these two models? Does the low-res one use half the memory? A tenth the memory? Maybe we could get crazy and say 5% of the memory. Well, it's actually 1,500 times smaller. Not 1,500%, 1,500 times. The high-res one uses 3 lossless 4096 by 4096 texture maps to get that level of detail. The new one uses a single 256 by 200 texture with indexed colors. If you want to be able to visualize that difference, here it is. So, as much as I really wanted to keep the Revanchist realistic and pull off something AAA quality, I've come to my senses and realized that this way is a lot better for the game in basically all regards. I first tried the retro visuals a couple of years ago, but I couldn't get the look right, and with the way I had it set up, it also didn't have much performance benefit. I never did like how it was working out, so I scrapped it. But a few months ago, I decided to give it another shot. I started off putting together this office level as a proof of concept, just to see if it's gonna work, and I was happy with the results. I used this level to prototype most of the game's mechanics, but it was never intended to be an actual part of the game. When it came time to actually start building levels, I put a lot more focus on atmosphere, and was much more deliberate with lighting, VFX, and the overall layout. The overall structure and gameplay loop very closely follows classic Resident Evil in particular, and aims to recreate the feel of those games in a package that's new and different, something that stands on its own and isn't just another Resident Evil clone. But one particular thing I'm focusing on in this game is choice. Specifically, invisible choices. Nearly everything you do is going to have some impact on the way things play out, even if it's just cosmetic. Like in playtesting, about half the players got to this room and saw this. The other half got here and instead were greeted with this. And I think that's as good a segue as any to talk a little bit more about the playtesting results. First things first, I really do want to thank all the people who playtested the game. It means a lot that people were so ready to take the time out of their day to play through this and give me feedback, and I really did learn a lot from it. So first let's talk positives. What did people like? The visuals were the most common thing that people complimented about the game. Some still aren't sold on the pixelation or the frame rate, capped at 30, but in general, people like the atmosphere and vibe with the visuals a lot. One thing that I noticed immediately is that it looks very wrong on non-ray tracing cards. It still runs perfectly fine, but the lighting looks very overexposed and blown out in some areas and way too dark in other areas with very hard shadows. It took a while to figure out why, since Unreal Engine 5's lumen lighting is perfectly compatible with software ray tracing and should still work. Eventually, I figured out the problem was megalights. Basically, megalights is a fairly new feature to Unreal, and it makes having a lot of dynamic, overlapping lights a little bit more efficient. It also changes the look of the lighting a little bit as a byproduct. What I didn't realize is megalights only works with hardware ray tracing. So to address this, I've added a setting to force software ray trace lighting and shadows, which will make software ray tracing look a lot more like the intended ray tracing setup. Because the game is really lightweight, this will still run fine on any older card with a bit of horsepower. A 1060 and up will be fine, but I'm going to leave it as an option so the game is still playable on lower end cards. A little bit further down the line, I do also want to add a way to manually disable it, because some people actually prefer the way it looks with the broken lighting, and I want people with ray tracing cards to at least have that choice. While the lighting isn't totally solved on non-ray tracing cards, it's mostly just a matter of tweaking and tuning things and shouldn't be too hard to get fixed up. Something else people liked was sound design, and that was a bit more of a surprise. I really don't know anything about sound design. I've never looked into it, never tried to learn it, and frankly never got far in any previous version of this game to get any experience with it. And the only takeaway I've really learned about sound design is this: add more sounds. That's it. That's the extent of my knowledge. I touched on this a bit before with the animation of the stairs falling. Even though it's about a 5-second sequence, there's just under 30 sound effects used to give it some impact. And the same goes for everything. More sounds. This 30-minute demo already features over 300 different sound effects, such as the lights, which emit a constant hum while they're on. I can also set them to make a noise when they flicker, which helps me set the tone in certain areas. In the spirit of adding sounds to everything, I also made bullet casings and shells make a sound when they collide with something, which honestly adds a lot to combat. But I think the single best bang for your buck addition to the sound design was the clocks. So the clocks in the game are actually functional. They start off at 10 PM when you start the game and count up in real time. Though depending on how you play, they might not stay accurate forever. That was a neat novelty, but I really made these for is the sound. Just having a clock ticking in the background is a great way to punctuate things and add a bit more atmosphere. It's surprisingly versatile. Like this one here in the safe room. The clock ticking almost feels relaxing and comforting, but still holds a bit of tension in the atmosphere. On the other hand, they can also add a lot of suspense and horror to some of the more tense moments, particularly if I speed them up. It's almost like a fast, pounding heartbeat or something, and really heightens the anxiety in certain scenes. The flip side of this is increasing the impact of silence. Just like in real life, in the Revanchist, silence is pretty rare. Be it wind blowing, lights buzzing, or machinery humming, there's usually some kind of sound. But on rare occasion, all of that fades away and leaves you with basically nothing. The fact that these quiet moments are few and far between leaves them with a lot more impact and helps really grab the player's attention and emphasize the horror. I also recorded sounds for the enemies. Just like the visuals, these are placeholder. I don't have the confidence to sit here making loud monster noises into the microphone, so there's a lot less energy in these than what I want, but again, it's close enough for now. Finally, and most surprisingly to me at least, is level design. I also don't know shit about level design. Additionally, this area of the game was not planned out at all. I just winged it and built the rooms as I went based solely on feel, and what that gave is a pretty disorienting and nonsensical floor plan. Now, bearing in mind I'm trying to recreate the feel of classic Resident Evil, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but since there's no map yet, it's also not ideal. This all being said, I did keep a few things in mind while making this area. First of all, worth mentioning is the prototype build that I'm testing is basically the tutorial or introduction area of the game. Because of that, it's pretty simple and the progression is almost completely linear. There's enough backtracking and detours to not make it feel completely linear, but it really is. But one thing I did to help people navigate this area without a map is using height to indicate what direction you're moving. Basically, every single level has a staircase, and the rule is as follows. If you're moving downwards, that means you're progressing and moving away from where you started. But if you're going upwards, that means you're backtracking towards the start. It's a kind of invisible yellow paint that tells you where to go without telling you that it's telling you, if that makes any sense. That is just going to be in the tutorial area though. After you go through this gate, things are going to open up quite a bit and I won't be able to keep that up. And on that note, why don't we take a look at some of the negative feedback? What didn't work about this game? Now, this one is a lot trickier to analyze. What I'm going to do here is this. I'm going to talk about some of the main criticisms people had and explain my thinking. Why did I make them the way they are? Now, it's not that I'm trying to invalidate criticism. Even if something is as intended, if most players experiencing a mechanic have a problem with it, that means I need to change something. Because in a lot of these cases, the game mechanic itself needs to stay more or less the same, as it's a core part of the experience for classic survival horror enthusiasts. What needs to change is the way I introduce these mechanics and the way they feel to make them approachable to any horror fan. Because bear in mind, my first goal with the Revanchist is to recreate the feel of those classic survival horror games that's kind of been lost in modern horror. And there's a lot of things those games do that are pretty unintuitive at a glance and are difficult to get a feel for in the first place. But as much as I'm focusing on that core classic RE audience, I want to make sure that the Revanchist is still enjoyable for people who aren't familiar with those games or their mechanics. What that means for me is I'm stuck in the middle and have to find a very delicate balance where I'm keeping the soul of these clunky and outdated design choices, but have to put the right spin on them so they're still palatable. The best example of this is combat. Combat is one of the more divisive aspects of the game so far, and the most common recurring thing I heard about it is that the enemies are too spongy. Counter-argument. No, but the reason they are the way they are is twofold. 1, time to kill. 2, ammo consumption. These are two of the most important aspects in keeping that classic survival horror balancing. As far as ammo consumption, that's an easy enough thing to compensate for. Right now it takes between 7 and 11 handgun shots to kill a basic enemy, and handgun ammo is found most commonly in stacks of 6 or 12. Now, I could cut the enemy back to taking 3 to 5 shots to kill instead and give out handgun ammo in stacks of 2 to 6, but then I feel that would make the balancing a bit too harsh, where even a couple of shots missed could waste an entire pickup of ammo. And then as far as time to kill, it's balanced for the enemy's movement. The low screen resolution, heavy fog, obscured sightlines, and laser sight aiming mean engaging in long-range combat isn't generally practical, and you usually start fighting enemies once you're around this range. From here, it'll take just slightly longer for an enemy to reach you than it does to kill them, as long as you don't miss much or have to reload. Which brings me back to the ammo balancing. Each gun, the starter weapons at least, holds enough ammo to comfortably kill a basic enemy without reloading. Remember, reloading with some ammo in the gun is a lot faster than reloading an empty weapon. Therefore, if you're paying attention to your ammo use and positioning, you'll usually be able to defeat enemies pretty comfortably. But if you panic or stop paying attention, then you're going to leave yourself in a very vulnerable spot. So does that mean the combat's fine and those playtesters are just being crybabies? Not necessarily. The combat sucked. I'll be the first to admit it. I think the core issue with the enemies feeling spongy is more so a lack of feedback, making it feel like your shots just aren't doing anything. The enemies did have stun and stagger animations, but they don't trigger with every shot. There is a blood splatter, but it's very large and difficult to pinpoint where it came from. There is also a sound effect, but it's pretty quiet and can be hard to hear over the gunshot. To combat this, I added a hit stun animation that's applied with every hit on target. I also added a function to slow the enemy's movement for a split second with every hit, buying you a bit more time with every shot landed. From there, I added some vocalizations to the enemies when they attack, get hit, or die. Then I tightened up the blood splatter, making it a lot easier to tell exactly where a shot landed, and added decals to the hit location. And finally, I added critical hits. Every headshot has a small critical chance, which does 4 times the damage, and if it's a kill shot... The shotguns also have a bonus critical mechanic. If every projectile lands as a headshot, it's a guaranteed critical. This not only makes combat feel better, but adds more distinction between the shorty and the shotgun, which will be found later as an upgrade. The shorty can pull off guaranteed critical hits, but it's risky, because you basically have to stuff the barrel down their throat if you want to land those consistently. The shotgun, on the other hand, despite doing the same base damage, has much tighter spread, so it works a little bit more like this. I haven't done a lot of playtesting with the new combat yet, but so far it's been received a lot better than the old combat system, even though the balancing is mostly the same. Next up is the puzzles. This is where I saw the biggest discrepancy between people with classic Resident Evil experience and people without it. People experienced with late 90s survival horror generally picked it up right away and never had much trouble. They understood the expectations and the flow of things, and since that's the core demographic I'm focusing on right now, I know I'm on the right track. The biggest criticism I heard from people without classic RE experience is that the puzzles/item use is inconsistent. Literally every single person used that exact wording, and they also said it at the exact same spot. Sounds pretty consistent to me. My response to that? It's not. So the issue people have for puzzles is that you have to manually use an item from your inventory. If you interact with the puzzle normally, you'll get a little bit of text, usually as a hint as to what you need to do, but it's up to you to open up your inventory and use an item. But if you're using a key to unlock a door, you don't do that. Just interacting with the door normally will use the key and unlock it. Once again, I think this is perfectly valid criticism, but the core issue isn't what people think, because it does follow rigid and consistent rules. Using a key or keycard to directly open a locked door, just interact with the door. Using any other item in any other way, crack open the inventory. And this isn't going to be changing. The doors aren't considered puzzles, so there's no need to make you deliberately use the key. If you have it, you can go. And as far as the puzzles, they're barely actually puzzles in and of themselves. Most of them boil down to finding the right item and using it at the right spot. The actual puzzle is finding the item, finding where you need to use it, and making that connection yourself. That you should use this item at this spot. If it automatically used the item, or even just automatically opened your inventory to state that you need to use an item there, it kind of defeats the whole point. This is another spot that I think the real issue is clarity. I need to find a way to better set these expectations for inexperienced players. As far as how exactly I'm going to do that, I'm not actually sure yet. I did add the ability to manually use keys on doors if you choose to, which did alleviate some of the confusion for players. I don't want to get too ham-fisted with it though, because as much as people were confused at first, nobody got stuck for long before figuring it out, since the first area is pretty linear and fenced in, so it's only an issue for the first couple of puzzles. Regardless, first impressions are important, and I don't want too much friction in the first 20 minutes or so I am going to be considering a few options to alleviate this. Finally, something very few people mention that I think they should have is notes. I did have a couple of people mention they're too long, and I 100% agree. I've been going through gradually, making some revisions and shortening the notes as I go, but most of them still run way too long. One playtester in particular, this channel's favorite niche internet micro-celebrity, definitely gave me the realest feedback out of anyone on this by completely skipping over all of them, which is exactly what I do in games if I open a note and get a big wall of text in front of me. I do not have the patience to read through this shit, so I feel ya. He did suggest highlighting important information, which is something I really should have thought of from the get-go. Better late than never, I'll be adding that soon enough. And that's pretty much where things are at for now. The current build is about 30 minutes of content, but first playthroughs are generally closer to an hour. There's a lot of small secrets and blink and you miss it scares that no one's found yet, which I'm happy with. Everybody's playthrough went differently, with some people triggering different events and unlocking different secrets. By the way, secrets isn't a great descriptor of how these things actually work, but I can't think of a better term that doesn't outright spoil how it all functions. So if you like what you're seeing, you can wishlist the Revanchist on Steam, link in the description.
I'm in your wall. Wishlist it. I'm in your wall. I know you smell different when you're not awake. Wishlist it. For your head.
If you want in on playtesting, check the Discord, link also in the description. If you got any other thoughts or opinions on the project so far, I would love to hear them. Hate comments especially. Great engagement. I've been getting a big boost in wishlist since I started responding to those.
You wanna talk some shit? Start some shit, bitch.
As always, thank you very much for watching, and have a fantastic rest of your day.